Hello and welcome to the Wagtail podcast. And today I have Clint with me. Hi, Clint.
Hello.
Uh, Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really appreciate that. I was keen to have you on the podcast because you have been a voice for so many years of just breaking down that stigma and normalizing talking about mental health. So that's why I really wanted you to come on, and I'm pleased you have. So would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you, and I'm happy to be here. So I am the author of No Idea What I'm Doing, a Daddy blog, which I've been at for what seems like an eternity. And mostly I started out blogging about my kids, which is where I kind of got my first few books were published about, marriage and family and parenting and all that. And then I don't know how long ago, it's probably been 2 or 3 years ago, I started writing more about my struggles with anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and that I was actually really anxious to write about, which is kind of funny to have anxiety about writing about your anxiety, but that seems like the most anxiety thing ever, right? And I started using my page to promote, mental illness support, particularly for men. And it's just kind of, I mean, I still write a lot about my kids, but it's all just kind of intermixed. And then I've published 3 books, and I write a column for the Netflix fandom site To Dumb, called Screen Time, about watching movies with my kids. I actually love that a lot. And I have a new book coming out called Anxiously Ever After, and it's a memoir about me learning to live with anxiety, and particularly obsessive compulsive disorder, and much of it in the shadow of my father's addiction to opioids, which I strongly suspect were his way of self-medicating. So I think I caught everything of me.
Yeah, that's comprehensive. Thank you. So what I like to do on the podcast is I like to ask people for their own definitions of wellness and resilience, to see what comes up, because people give lots of different answers. So I wonder if you might be able to explore those couple of things.
Geez, my definition of wellness and resilience.
Or one or the other. Or...
Well, I mean, I know that when I first met with a therapist, I think I was 19, and I had essentially a nervous breakdown. I didn't realize that's what it was at the time, and most of it had to do with anxiety. And he asked me about my skills for mental health management, and I told him, and I honestly didn't know what he was talking about. Like, this was not ever heard. It was like during the intake, and he, scribbled some things down, and I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And so it took me a long time before I started to accept that managing mental illness, like the best gift I can give my family and my children is for me to manage my mental illness. And ultimately what that looks like for me is kind of this trifecta of I've got to manage my medications. I got to be on the right medications. I've got to manage my own mental illness. I've got to do the hard work of that, meditation, mindfulness, trying to avoid, negative self-talk, that sort of stuff, which is is a trap that I fall into a lot. And taking care of my own physical body. So regular exercise. I'm an avid cyclist, eating the right foods, trying to avoid caffeine, which I'm actually not very good at, but I'm doing okay with the other 3. So I guess it all balances out. But I think ultimately wellness, that's what it's had to become for me, is to really sit down and say, am I checking those 3 boxes? Am I taking my medications? Are they still working? Because, periodically I have to change my medications, and man, that's terrible every time I have to do that. So yeah, I mean, that's ultimately what wellness looks like for me, is it's almost like a checking of boxes. Am I doing the work that is necessary for me to be able to maintain at least a livable, happy life?
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned your family there, and obviously if anybody's read the blog, or hopefully they will if they haven't, like you say, you focus a lot on your family, like your wife, who sounds amazing, and your beautiful kids. Are they like your main driver, or did you think back when you were 19 that you could do it for you, or did you think I've got to do this, for a future family?
I was 19 years old. I didn't think about much long term,
Yeah.
to be perfectly honest. And I avoided therapy and I think I for a long time thought that if I just avoided it, that it would go away. And I think eventually it was my second nervous breakdown in my 30s that actually pushed me back into therapy, because I stopped doing it. But yeah, I think, my childhood was, I would describe it as chaotic. And my father, who I think, he was became addicted to opioids when I was early, probably 7 or 8 or something. And then he started to show signs, and I didn't realize at the time that he probably had bipolar disorder. And it just caught there, it's 10 years after he became addicted to opioids that he died ultimately from 10 years of drug addiction. My childhood was very unsettled, lots of marriages, lots of divorces. I eventually kind of ran away from home when I was 14, lived with my grandmother. And so I was really afraid to even have a family. I was having problems with obsessive compulsive disorder. And when I met Mel, that's my wife, she was the first person that I met that I thought, I really, really love her. And I'd like to be a different person so I could be who she needs me to be, because I'd like to be with her long term. And so, yeah, I guess back to your earlier question, I think a big motivator of me wanting to live a more healthy and balanced life with mental illness has slowly progressed from me saying to myself, I can't be my father, and I can't self-medicate, and I can't put these people that I genuinely love through what I went through with him. And so I'm going to have to be something better, something different. And that's really caused me to kind of dig in and try to be a better husband. And some of that, and a lot of that, it took me years to realize, has come down to my own self-care. Like if I'm not taking care of myself, I can't take care of the kids, and I can't be the husband that I need to be and I want to be, and to be better than what I was raised in. So I guess it's funny, this book that's coming out, one of the reviewers said that it inspired her to not give her to not give her children a childhood that they would need to recover from. And I think that is really what I'm trying to do right now, is to not give my children something that they'll need to recover from. And you know what? I'm raising a teenager right now, and he might completely disagree. But we're just going to have to see how it goes. But I'm trying. And so much of that has come down to just taking care of my own wellness.
See, that's a really powerful review, isn't it? You must be quite pleased with that one.
Yeah, I'm trying. This book that's coming out, I started, in fact, so a little backstory. So I went to college with Brené's brother, Lauren, or Laws, whatever he decides to go by those days. And we worked together on a literary journal in our undergrad, and that's how we got to be friends. And I didn't realize it at the time, but some of the essays I was working on when we were friends, in 2007, 2008, are ultimately in this book that's coming out. And it's just been, so I've been working on this sucker for 12, 13 years and not realizing it, but slowly plucking away. And then eventually it was, my master's thesis, and I've been rejected I literally have hundreds of agents that have rejected me, and publishers. I have spreadsheets of shame, and it has taken many, many forms. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like this has been a really, really long process, and I am so nervous about this book coming out because it took me so long to get here. And there's something about creating something and and trying to get it to work for so long, and then fearing that it's just going to completely crash. And I don't know. It's definitely not helping my wellness or mental health management at this point. And it comes out, on November 8th, so in less than a month. But yes, I was the reviewers that have read it have been very kind, and I do enjoy that. But it really, in this day and age, I don't even know how much people care about the reviews on the back of the book. They worry about the reviews on Amazon, and so that's really where the rubber's going to meet the road, is just real readers reading it and deciding if this helped them. And I'm hoping to help people. That's my goal. Fingers crossed.
Great. We're going to come back to the book, but could I possibly bring you back to your dad and ask you a question?
Go ahead.
I'm just interested in how, like, breaking the cycle. You know how lots of people, they have really rough childhoods like you've had, and then it's really hard to get out of a cycle, and sometimes it's a generational cycle. How did you do that? Like, when do you remember the exact moment when you thought, actually, I'm not going to do that?
I mean, I know that it's interesting when you write a memoir, because you sit and you look at like the turning points in your life, right? And you say, okay, so where were these turning points? And I can tell you one of the biggest turning points that I had was after my father died. He died in his apartment, and he was dead for a few days before somebody found him. He had burned every bridge. I was having my own mental health problems. The last time I saw him was on Thanksgiving, and he died early December. And Thanksgiving in America, Thanksgiving. And then I went, and so my brothers and we cleaned out his apartment. And, I think in hindsight, there are people that you would pay to do something like that. But the three of us, it's my brother and my half brother. We just handled it, and you could see how he died. You could just look at the mess and see the last of it. You could still smell, it was the most wretched smell of him being in there dead for several days. And after that, it was almost a year of recurring dreams of me dying and as him. And I kept having these horrible nightmares where I was either watching him die or I was him dying. And I started to realize, and it was almost, and I don't know if it was God or a ghost, like insert scary ghost, woo sounds, but it felt like somebody or something, or my subconscious, somebody was trying to tell me that you're headed this way. Like, this is what it's going to look like for you. And at the time, I was doing some of not to the level he was, but I was struggling with my own medications. I was abusing them. I was going to different doctors to try and get more medications. And I was dealing with flaming obsessive compulsive disorder. It controlled my life for 2 years, right about the time he died. And that dream helped me realize I have to do something different. I cannot end this way. And that really was one of the biggest turning points in my life, was I just had to stop. In fact, and I bring this up in the book, at the time, it's funny, I was working at like a home improvement store, and that's where I met my wife, and I was trying to get a job as a prison guard, because I thought, I didn't do very well in school. I didn't know how to type. I barely graduated high school. I'd never read a novel, which is ironic to think about now. And I eventually was supposed to do a polygraph test, and then I would have been accepted into this academy. And I lied a bunch on the application and different things, and mostly about my trying to hide my mental illness. And I went to the freeway. It was I-15 in Utah, and I was supposed to turn right to go down to the prison to take this polygraph test. and I just went left, and I went to an open enrollment college, which is where I ended up graduating. That's where I met your brother. And I just walked down the hallway and kept saying, I'd like to be a student here. How do I do that? And I kept asking that question until I was enrolled in classes. And that ultimately, like, my life, everything changed over those two moments. Like, everything just started to go in a very different direction.
Wow, so that was like a split decision.
Yep. I went left instead of right. That was it. I was
Wow.
stopped at the light and I thought, do you really want to work in a prison? And I went, and yeah, I went to college and then went to grad school, and Mel actually taught me how to type.
Yeah.
So like it was funny, like my first semester of college, my first classes, I would handwrite my papers and then I would read them to Mel and she would type them as I read them to her, because my handwriting was so bad, my spelling was so bad, she couldn't read what I had written. And that was a one semester, and then she's like, you're gonna have to figure this out. So she helped me figure out how to type. So I don't know, but yeah, I mean, as far as like breaking the cycle, I mean, those moments really changed, but it has been a perpetual, it's like my father, it's totally a blessing and a curse, because it's interesting to look so much back at his life as I have, and see that he really was trying to be a good man, and then he fell into the opioid epidemic early. And so much of it, I don't know how much of it was him and how much of it was the system and how much of it was the drugs. A lot of the decisions he's made, and the time in jail and the way he hurt a lot of my family members. But I can say that a real motivator for me to try and be better was him, and looking back at those dreams and looking back at the hardship that I had to do to just try and, learn to live with, some of the stuff that was going on. And it has motivated me to try and be something other than what I was. And that's why I named my blog No Idea What I'm Doing, because I didn't have a dad. I didn't feel like I had much of a role model. And so I was like, going into this blind. But the more I've written about my kids, and the more I've started to realize most parents feel that way. So
So what was your first step? You said, I can't carry on this way, I need to make changes. So was your first step therapy, or was your first step trying to figure it out by yourself?
Oh, it was all me just trying to figure it out by myself. I went into a therapist at 19 when I started having really bad problems with obsessive compulsive disorder. And then shortly after my dad died, I actually just stopped going. And I still took a lot of the medications, but I just stopped. And then I just thought to myself, I'm just going to manage this on my own. I thought that therapy meant that I was crazy, and I didn't want that label. And, when I started having those dreams, I actually stopped taking the majority of the medication, because I was worried medication meant I was becoming my father. And so, I mean, occasionally I would take like a sleeping pill when I'd have anxiety at night. And I was like, I'm just going to gorilla through it. And there was one point, particularly when I was in grad school, where Mel was just kind of like, and I was a mess, and I was starting to have a lot of the same problems that I had previous before we were married, as far as obsessions and tics and depression. And she finally just said, you need to do something. Like, I can't continue this way. And we had 2 kids, and she didn't say that she was going to leave me, but it seemed very clear that that's the direction we were headed. And I really love her, and I really loved her. And I was like, I'm going to have to. And that was when I started going back to get on medication. So I don't know. It's been a lot of me just being stubborn and falling into, I think a lot of men run into this, this idea that you should be stronger than this. And I'm sure women run into it too, but there's this kind of tough guy stereotype that you're like, yeah, I shouldn't need help in this area. And it wasn't until I started to realize that, accepting that help would change and help me to be able to live a more balanced life and be the man that I wanted to be and the father that I wanted to be. That's when things started to really, really change.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of stigma. Would you say that was stigma from society, or would you say you had some self-stigma about what that meant as well?
Oh, I that's a tough one to unpack. I mean, I know that, my father was I would describe him as a cowboy type, worked with his hands. And I grew up in rural Utah, and it was, farm work, and he was a heating air conditioning contractor, and, lots of welders and hammers and that sort of stuff. And I don't think anybody ever sat across from me and said, "Hey, don't go to a therapist because that means you're weak." You don't need medication for that sort of stuff. Well, I guess maybe I did hear that sort of stuff, but anyways, I guess what I'm trying to say is that's what it just seemed like a slow kind of accepting that managing mental illness was a sign of weakness. And self-medication seemed to be what I had seen through drugs and alcohol, and I eventually had to really pull away from that. And I'm sure that there are lots of other men that need to do this, that probably ought to do the same thing. And I am, it's interesting. The more I've written about my mental illness, particularly online, the more I will receive messages predominantly from men that will say, I didn't want to post this publicly, but I have X, Y, and Z, the same problems. And I'm like, dude, exercise, medication, therapy. Like, that's my and it's one of those things that like boggles my mind, because at the end of the day, I'm just some rando on the internet. I'm just some dude, typing out stuff online. I'm not a doctor or therapist. But I will have people reach out to me regularly, and I try to direct them to professionals. I'm like, go, don't feel bad about it. Do it. It'll change your life.
It's an important role, though, what you're doing, because that kind of lived experience, peer to peer, especially in the UK, that kind of the research around that kind of support is far better than the support that people get from the medical world. It's something that is really supportive. It's very much valued, and people really feel listened to in that arena. So, and you've been brave enough to go out there and say it publicly, which is rare.
See, and that's what's so interesting. I hear that, like, you're so brave. I hear that regularly, like, people will use brave. And I don't see myself as brave at all. Like I said, I just see myself as some rando on the internet, writing about his experiences. I know that one of the things that's interesting to think about is, the more and this happened with my kids, the more I wrote about my kids, the more it got me thinking about my kids. And I think it made me a better father. And same with marriage. It taught me to really sit and think about, what is expected of a husband in this role, and what needs to be thrown out of the window. Right. And the same thing has happened with mental illness. The more I've written about it, the more I've had people. I thought that I would be mocked when I first started, and I thought that I would run into, and don't get me wrong, I do get that. And I mean, the internet is a wild place, and it is full of lots of people. But for the most part, I get, hey, you've helped me. You have supported, you have helped me look at things differently, or you've helped. I love when I get, like, I made an appointment with a therapist for the first time, or I looked into getting medication because of X, Y, and Z post. And that's the stuff that speaking of positive self-talk, that's the stuff I'm trying to lean on, and not, some of the other stuff I run into.
But that is the bravery, isn't it? The bravery to put yourself out there, despite the fact that you're going to get mocked, and despite the fact that you're being completely vulnerable, and despite the fact that still society doesn't want to talk about mental health. So there is bravery in that.
Well, listen, I love what you're saying, and I appreciate it, and it's very kind. I don't know. I still have a hard time seeing it as brave, but maybe I need to change the way I approach these things. But I see myself as, I mean, I've always been, I need to write. Writing has become a real part of how I process life. Um, and I've always, and your brother will attest to this, I've always been an oversharer, for good or bad, but it is one of those things that I will say I do like feeling like I'm helping others. And that has ultimately kept me going. Because, a lot of people assume that writing is my full-time job, and that ultimately is not the case. I work in universities. I've worked in universities for years. And so, I get up at 4 a.m. and that's when I write. And I've done it for years. And so much of it is selfish. I need that time to try and process my life. But if I can help people while I'm doing it, well, that's a good motivator too. So.
Okay, so we've got medication, therapy, exercise, and writing as what you would say were really big strategies to help you through. Yeah. But what I want to ask you about, though, is negative self-talk, because you said at the beginning that you do try and change that. Have you got any strategies for how you turn those thoughts around?
I mean, one of the best things I've ever done is to explain, like, to try and talk to somebody that you trust, like my spouse, and say, this is where I'm being, like, this is how I think in this scenario, and have them look at you and be like, that is terrible. That is wrong. And these are all the ways that they are wrong. Because I will, and this is so anxiety, I will look at the worst case scenario, like, this is what's going to happen, like this, well, it could happen, and I'm going to take it like 5 steps until I'm dead in a gutter. And Mel will give me this kind of like, we're going to pump the brakes and let's really think about, no, like that. I mean, it could happen, but it's really, really unlikely. And stuff like that has helped. I've tried very hard to, I struggle a lot with, recognizing my own accomplishments as a human and as a father and as a writer and as a professional and all that stuff. And I've had to try and take a step back and really reflect and focus, on the positive rather than the negative. And it is a conscious thing. But I will say that, it's funny, I was discussing this with my son. So one of my daughters has ADHD, and she's always distracted, right? Her default setting is to be distracted. And we've had to work to try and, coach her and teach her ways to focus. And so I was explaining to him that my default setting is fear and worst case scenarios, and at times depression. Like, that's what I so easily fall into. And I have had to sit and try and find strategies and ways to talk to myself to say, no, that's the anxiety talking. In fact, some really great advice I got from a therapist was to personify your anxiety, give it a name. Mine is Bob, which is a bland name, but that's what I came up with. And to talk like, no, that's Bob talking, like, oh yeah, things are going to be terrible. No, that's just Bob coming in and being a jerk. And any way you can try and find ways to make Bob as goofy looking as possible so you can laugh at him, maybe just make him some, creepy, terrifying monster with tiny nipples, like something that just really gives you an opportunity to laugh at him. And those sorts of ways, they're kind of cheesy, but they've helped me. Other strategies that I've picked up, I had a therapist tell me one time, so many of my stories start with, I was talking to my therapist, but we were talking about my dog, and I think he's a Chiweenie. He was the nicest dog the pound had. It's a small yappy dog, right?
Okay.
It was brown and
like a Chihuahua crossed with something.
I can't remember. Anyways, he's a small, listen, here's what you need to know. He is a small dog that drives me insane. And my kids love that dog. And I'm very good to the dog, but I am over him barking. Like he just,
Yeah.
if someone looks at the house, he's going to have an opinion. And so I was discussing this with my therapist, and he said, well, anxiety is kind of like that. Because if you think about it, like that dog thinks that it's an alarm. He thinks that there is somebody's breaking in the house. It's an axe wielding maniac, right? But chances are it's just an elderly couple going on a walk. And so, that's what your anxiety does. It's just, it's trying to do his job. You just happen to have a small brown yippy dog inside of you that's ready to bark all the time. And so really saying to yourself, okay, that's just my anxiety trying to help, and saying thank you for the alert, but I don't think there's any real concern. And that's sort of trying to put the logic in it, because anxiety is it's not logical. Like, even when I look at, like, when I was having serious trouble with anxiety and OCD, and I still struggle with a lot of that stuff, but when it really ran my life, I was told at one point that exercise could help you be less anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow that just got brought to 11. And I thought that I needed to exercise to prevent anxiety. And suddenly I was exercising anywhere from 2 to 8 hours a day, never missing a day. I was having trouble with my kidneys bleeding because I was exercising too much, but I could not take a day off. I was so afraid that if I wasn't exercising and good and tired. And really, if you sit and try to explain that to anybody outside of what I was living with, they're like, well, that's inaccurate, right? That doesn't make any sense. And it was, and it didn't, but I had the hardest time pulling the logic into it. That chances are I could go without exercise and be just fine. But that's what anxiety does to you. It causes you to look at things that really should be simple and twist them into ways that can ruin your life, and it takes constant management.
Yeah. And how did the OCD impact you on the most impactful times?
How did it? Well, I mean, when it was at its worst, it was like a 2-year period. And, I mean, my schedule was, I had to go to bed. A lot of it was around sleep, and I would have anxiety at night. And I had these panic attacks at night. And what I don't think is often discussed is how a panic attack or an anxiety attack, it's painful. I don't think people realize that. Like, it would cause tightness in my stomach, like I've been punched in the gut. It could cause me to throw up. It could cause me cold sweats. Like, I mean, these are real physical manifestations of absolute terror that can last for sometimes days. And it can really, really twist the way you perceive life. And for me, it was exercise. I went on I remember a therapist telling me that I should exercise more and it would help me. And so I went on a bike ride and I wasn't so anxious. And slowly it became that if I didn't go on a bike ride, I would have anxiety. And it kind of, like, the whole paradigm shifted. And I got to the point where, I would get up, I had to go to bed. It was like a contract. I had to be in bed by 10. If I got to bed later than 10, I was afraid I'd have anxiety, which would ultimately, that fear of having anxiety would cause anxiety. And I was afraid that if I slept too long, then I wouldn't be able to get to sleep the next night. So I had to get up by 7. But if I had to get up before 7, that would cause anxiety. And so I had this very rigid schedule. I had to, an hour before I went to bed, I needed to meditate. If I didn't meditate, then I wouldn't be able to get to sleep, and then I would have anxiety. And then if I didn't exercise at least 2 hours, right, I was afraid I wouldn't be tired enough to go to sleep. But oftentimes, if I exercised 2 hours and then still had anxiety, which was quite likely, the next day I would say, well, I got to exercise 3. And then maybe, well, I'll bet I'll exercise 4. And then it just kind of took off from there. And it got to the point where I mean, any free time that I had, I was exercising. And then, you know, I was working at that, uh, you know, home improvement place, and I would do like push-ups and pull-ups in between work
Right.
and stuff to try and make sure that I was tired enough to get to sleep at night. And it was, I mean, it eventually got to where it felt like I was trying to outrun or out exercise my anxiety, which that's not how it works. I had to learn to live a more balanced life.
I wonder if I could just like make an observation about your work, because it's quite witty. You're a funny guy, and I wonder if humor plays a part in your mental health kind of maintenance or recovery. It's all.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I know my family loves when I tell them that I'm a humorist. They they all roll their eyes. I'm like, well, I am a humorist. Um, I I had a therapist advise that, like, make fun of your anxiety.
Okay.
Be funny with it. And it has helped, and I do try to do that to some extent. But um, it's interesting because the cynicism of depression, anxiety, I think is part of what makes me funny. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there, that it's like, if I completely got rid of it, maybe I wouldn't be so witty anymore.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I have tried to do that and tried to make fun of it. And that comes across in a lot of my work. Um, I don't know. I mean, I wish I was better at it. I wish I was better at laughing at my own anxiety, but that's something I am working on. And I have been recommended to do that.
Okay. Okay. So tell us now more about your book.
Sure.
So it comes out in America, as you said, 8th of November. I think it's 12th of December in the UK. When I last looked.
Oh, I didn't realize that I had two release dates. You've noticed more than I have.
You've got two release dates, yeah. So I'm going to have to wait another month, but I'm patient. So yeah. So it's okay. So you were saying it started years ago. So tell everybody what it's about and what to expect from it.
I mean, it's most of my books previously have been, well, all of my books previously have been like essay collections, humorous essay collections, and this is a memoir that it's a fully functioning narrative that ultimately tells a story of, it starts with my father's drug addiction and then slowly builds into me, beginning to have issues and learning with issues with anxiety, and coming to terms with it, and coming to those realizations that, I had to figure out who my father was, and I had to forgive him. I had to find some way to forgive him. And so much of that came down to me looking at his life and really looking at it. Whereas before, he was kind of this murky character in and out. And really, looking at his criminal record, talking to people that knew him, trying to find actual photos. I had very few photos of my father before I started writing this. And then the book, it's me learning to break the cycle and come to terms with my anxiety and how to live a balanced life with it as a husband and father. And then realizing that, one of the biggest fears I had of having kids was that I would pass this on. And I have. My kids, they struggle with it. And I'm grateful that, I know enough about myself to try and teach them, how to better manage it. Not that, they necessarily listen to me, but I certainly try. But that's what the book is ultimately about, is me learning to live with anxiety. And so much of it in the shadow of my father's addiction to opioids, but also funny. There are definitely funny moments, but there's a lot of it that's, it's hard to make it funny.
Yeah.
But I guess my hope is that it'll help particularly men, because there just aren't a lot of men writing about mental illness. And not that the publishing industry makes it any easier. When I tried to publish this book originally, or well, like I said, I've been rejected by a lot, but when I really started to pitch it as a mental health memoir, I think originally it was more about trying to understand, fatherhood and I heard from many publishers that they liked my following, they liked, my writing, but people don't buy books about mental illness written by men. And that was the roadblock I ran into with the majority of publishers. And I think that, and you know what? They might be right. We're going to find out here in about a month. But I do know that I think there are a lot of men that probably ought to read it, particularly now, post, as we're kind of pulling our way out of a pandemic. I think mental health and learning to live with mental illness is of real importance. So anyways, yes, the book comes out. Apparently there are 2 release dates. And it's just about me trying to learn to live with mental illness.
I'm interested to read it, and if I can, I've got a little shop and there's a book collection in the shop, and I can say that men do buy mental health books because the books are just to do with mental health and emotional well-being. So, and men do buy them, so I hope that's encouraging. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
But I wonder, can I quickly take you back to that theme of forgiveness? Because forgiveness is really hard, and many people find it difficult, and we can carry grudges forever, but we're forever being told, forgive for you, not for the person, because it's going to release you from this heavy weight that you've got on your shoulders. I'm intrigued what it did for you and how much it took.
I mean, I was pretty ticked off at my dad for decades, right? And frustrated with him. And the best thing I could have done was to really just sit down and look at his life. And this is in the book, but I actually dug up a couple of very close friends of his. And the reason I dug them up is because my nephew ran into them. He was working for one of them. And he said that, your dad before the drug, or your grandfather, I guess what he said, before the drugs, he was a good guy, And that was the first time I heard somebody say something positive about my dad. Most people were ticked off at him because he just made some hard decisions, and he ruined. A lot of people lost money, working with him, and finances were definitely a big discussion. And so I dug those guys up, and I went and met with them, and all they just told me about how hard he tried, how hard he worked, how he was, trying to be a good father. And it was that binary of actually seeing him try, seeing this image of him as a good human that made me realize that, he was a subject of a time and place. I mean, he probably had bipolar disorder. He was in rural Utah and when mental illness in the 80s and 90s, when mental illness was not discussed, particularly among men, it was tough it out. And then he got hurt on the job, and they gave him opioids, and they kept pumping those in him because that's what doctors did in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. And then he probably went into a manic state, and the mania was crazier than it had ever been because he was on opioids, and he never got away from them. He was completely addicted. And knowing that, did it make any of the hardships and the way he treated my mother and my siblings and some of the, visiting him in jail and the lies and not paying child support and all that stuff that was just a mess. Did it justify that? No, not necessarily, but at least it gave me enough of an image of him to be able to say, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. and that some of this was his drug addiction, a lot of this was drug addiction and mental illness, and the time that he was around. And, you know, it helped me be able to put it behind me. Because, I mean, I just turned 40, and I don't need another 40 years of being pissed off at my dad, you know?
Yeah,
So.
sure. Thank you. Okay, I got one last question, Clint.
Go ahead.
That is, I like to leave on a real positive. So can you name
Let's try.
Can you name a value or a strength within you that is really strong that you use for your well-being in a positive way?
Oh, I don't know. That sounds like positive self-talk right there. I would say, gosh, I don't know. I guess it's, I mean, I want to help. I see myself as a helper. And I think that, I don't know, like trying to help the people around me, help my family, help the people that read my writing. Like I feel like that has definitely brought a positive, rewarding part of my, you know, rewarding light in my life. And that's, so yeah, I think trying to identify myself as someone that helps, tries to help people, I think has helped me feel better about who I am. And that's pretty important when you struggle with depression, anxiety. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, right. Well, we'll leave it there. And I want to say thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Happy to chat with you.
Excellent. And yeah, we'll put links to the book in the podcast and advertise the book as well. I'm really excited to read it. Actually, I'm going to be getting it on release day, and I hope other people will too. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. It was wonderful meeting you, and tell your brother I said hello.
I will. Thank you.